Okay.
Hello and welcome for another episode of Profiles in American Funded Research. My guest today is Dr. Greg Breed, and he got a bachelor's degree at the University of Minnesota, a master's degree at Texas A&M, a PhD in Dalhousie. Is that the correct
Dalhousie.
pronunciation? Dalhousie,
Dalhousie.
okay,
Yeah.
Dalhousie University. Did some postdocs, one at UC Santa Cruz and at Harvard, and is now a professor at University of Alaska Fairbanks. Did I get everything correct there?
It's associate professor, but otherwise, yeah.
Oh, perfect. And I invited Greg on today to discuss a project, an NSF project that he has, reconstructing interactions of species ensembles, generalized dynamic frameworks for exploring ancient marine communities through time. Would you be able to give us just a brief overview of what that is about, and then we can go from there?
Yeah, it's essentially we have science generally, not us specifically. We have built there's a body of work that has gone into understanding how modern ecosystems function. That is to say, how nutrients and energy flow through ecosystems via connections among ecosystem members. And by connections, we mean generally one thing is eating another, usually consumer networks. Those are the direct effects, but there's also things called indirect effects, which is things like competition or one organism influences another via its impact on a third species that interacts with both of them. So there's been a lot of work doing that for modern networks, but there is an interest in understanding how historical and paleo-ecological networks have also functioned. These are harder to evaluate because we know less about them. We know what was there for the most part, but we have less knowledge about how big populations were of various ecosystem members and what who was interacting with who. So we're building models that will give us, some. We're constructing. This is me and colleagues at University of California, Merced, Justin Yackel, and Sora Kim, are building models that can evaluate how past ecosystems, in this case, pre-European settlement ecosystems in the Northwest Atlantic Ocean. So basically, the area that was fished down with, that was most highly impacted once North America was settled by Europeans, and that's the Georges Banks Goshen Shelf and Grand Banks and Gulf St. Lawrence. And our second question is how. So it turns out when whales developed baleen, this happened around 20 or 30 million years ago. Not exactly known where, but you have a huge change in how those large organisms interact with their ecosystem because large animals generally need to eat things that are between 1 and 10% of their body size, so to efficiently forage. And what baleen allowed them to do was to just let them feed on like very small organisms efficiently. And that means that you don't have any of this trophic transfer loss. So every time you go up one food web, that is to say, every time something eats something below it or eats something, only 10% of that energy gets made into body tissue of the next animal. So to make a very large animal requires like seven, well, not seven, but three, four, or five transfers of carbon, of fixed carbon to the next level, and that's just a huge loss of biomass that moves to the next level, which means there's very little left once you get to something the size of a whale. And if you can skip that, which whales, the evolution of baleen allowed, you can suddenly move a huge amount of carbon from the base of the food chain, which is say the phytoplankton, and copepods to the very largest animals. Like 1,000 times more carbon can move up than would have been if it has to move through the chain, maybe even 10,000 times. So that allows, with that much biomass at the top of the food chain or food web, you would expect a really different functioning of the ecosystem, and we want to build models that allow us to evaluate that. And one of the things that we know that allowed was the evolution of megalodon sharks, because without a huge amount of biomass for some very large sharks to eat, there's no reason there wouldn't be a way for them to survive. So that is those are the two big questions that we have. One is sort of closer to our current ecosystem state, which is what happens when we removed all this stuff from the Northwest Atlantic from fishing after European settlement, and one is much further in the deep time past, 30 or 40 million years ago. What happened when whales evolved this really extraordinary feeding structure that, in terms of changing the way the overall ocean ecosystem structure worked.
Now, I'm curious because it's in your it's actually right in the title of the project. So what is the generalized dynamic model? Is it like a differential equations type thing, or are we talking about, or is this
Yeah, it's a differential equation model, but it is solved. So typically we have models that um, they require specific parameters to run. And that's to say, like very discrete numerical values. And in order to explore the whole parameter space, the whole model dynamics, you need to run models with every possible combination of parameters. And that turns out, once you have more than 3 or 4 ecosystem members, it becomes really impossible to do practically and to evaluate the dynamics of the whole space. So generalized models allow you to explore this how models structured a certain way should operate across a wide variety of parameter spaces, but without knowing what the parameters are and what should be generally or specifically. And because of that, we can evaluate the stability in a general way, the structure of an ecosystem with X number of ecosystem members, where a much larger number of ecosystem members, which is not possible using what are known as specific models, which is when you have very specific parameters, that govern the growth and death and mortality and consumption rates of various ecosystem members.
so how do you measure, how do you determine the species interactions from the distant past? I think you kind of hinted at the fact that that's a challenging thing already, but I'm curious how you figure out what the interactions are. How do you know who
Well,
ate who?
we know that we can look at modern systems, and for the most part, a predator will eat things that are between 1 and 10% of its body size. And there are deviations from that like polar bears eat much larger animals sometimes, but most marine animals in particular are known as gape limited, which just means they can only eat things that fit in their mouth, essentially. And so we can look at those general rules, and um, we can infer who likely eats who. And we mean that likelihood, it's a probabilistic thing. Because there is some probability that animals can and will eat at a slower rate animals that are outside the sort of 1 to 10% size range. So that's typical. Um, and if we have that, we can probabilistically assemble food web networks from what all should be based on probability and knowledge of first principles of how feeding dynamics works, what the food web should look like in terms of who's eating who, um, and how the direct and indirect effects should work. Now, what we don't have and can't know are the exact parameters, the exact rates of consumption, or the exact population sizes, which is where the generalized modeling framework is important, comes in.
And I think also there's probably hidden in there also a lot of variability in other things because we don't know, we didn't obviously we can't get exact measurements of temperature or something from the distant past. We can get, within some uncertainty or whatever, but we can't. I imagine that probably adds, does that add some variability as well to, because you also
Well,
look at energetic climate.
we don't worry too much about that. The physics of the ocean helps us a lot there. Um, we actually, so a couple things. One, you can actually measure temperature in a general way from 018 fixation rates, and in carbonates, for example, which allow you to evaluate how, because it's a process that the different isotopes of oxygen are fixed at different rates depending on the temperature. And in the ocean, you're not going to have a huge range of temperature because it's not going to be below -2 degrees. It's, at deep pressures, the temperature of water freezes at about -2, and we don't see any ice at the bottom of the ocean. And so we know it's going to be, and the other thing that the ocean does is it kind of it generally modulates the temperatures that you're going to see. It's not going to be super warm, and we're mostly looking at temperate oceans, so it's going to kind of range between 0 and 20 C. Um, but there's not any big spikes in temperature, so it's going to, the warmer temperatures are going to be speed things up a little bit, and the cold temperatures speed things up, slow things down some. But mostly we're not worried about that, and that actually isn't even in modern ecosystem models. We don't usually have provisions for daily changes in temperature or even seasonal changes in temperature. Maybe seasonal changes in the dynamics, but not the temperature per se.
So how how does studying this past help us understand our present and future?
Well, one thing that we have a problem with when we look out our windows to see what the ocean's doing right now is we have a problem of imagining what the system should have looked like even before, so for example, the of the two measurements, of the two kind of scenarios we're looking at, one is the deep time pass and one is just a little before human exploitation. Um, we have a real trouble looking at the ecosystems we have at hand and trying to understand how they functioned before humans really started to cause extinctions and exploit them in a big way. So understanding how the stability of those ecosystems before exploitation is of great value in understanding what we should be trying to achieve with our current management plans, for both fisheries and conservation of large whales and sharks. So that's the main reason there. But and for the deep time, it's looking at the evolution of baleen and its effect on ecosystem structure. That is understanding how life arrived at where it is now in terms of overall evolution of species and the health of the planet is a great interest in, basic science interest. Again, to understand how it might change in the future. But I think there is always just a deep curiosity about the origins of life and how it got here. And it's not necessarily going to lead us to the next breakthrough in cancer, but we have always walked around the landscape and seen dinosaur bones and thought, what was that like? And that is that is one of the things that makes just Earth a special place, to have this incredible history, paleoecological history and past, and to go see reconstructed T-Rexes at the Natural History Museum. But what we haven't focused on so much is what were those ecosystems doing in terms of functioning. We've documented what was there in terms of species, but we don't know, and we've sort of speculated about who's eating who, but we don't know how they were functioning and was it stable. And there's a lot of reasons to think that for like the dinosaurs, the very large size made, actually put them in kind of an unstable situation because they were just more sensitive. And being that large, they would have had large impacts on the system and then small changes in herbivores, which are things like the brontosaurus and duckbill dinosaurs, could have really changed the way the ecosystem functioned because now you have more vegetation than you did and then suddenly less um, less prey for predators, and suddenly the whole ecosystem's just functioning differently.
So, from now, after listening to some of the things you said, it sounds almost like being really large is a pretty big disadvantage because you're very sensitive to potentially small changes at the lower level of the lower trophic levels.
That's exactly right. When you are dependent, when you are obeying the ordinary rules of trophic ecology, which is you're only feeding on things that have fed on things and fed on things, and you have that trophic transfer efficiency, which is why baleen was such a novel adaptation. It lets you get around that trophic transfer efficiency and give you access to much more predictable resources. There is a tendency for things to become large. There, there's a lot of selection pressure to become large in vertebrates in particular, because in general, you become less vulnerable to predation. As you get larger, there's less predators that can eat you. There's also a physiological effect where your mass specific um, me metabolic rates go down. So you use less energy per kilogram of tissue you have, the larger you get. You also, when you're within species, there's sexual competition, and larger males do better, and larger females can provision their young better. So there's lots of evolutionary incentives to get larger. But there's the disadvantage in there's less and less resources available. Once you get to a certain size, it becomes really difficult. So baleen is sort of short-circuiting the ecosystem for these super large animals, the largest ever animals, so that they can take advantage of all the things of being large, as well as, but also not having the disadvantage of having to suffer all that trophic transfer efficiency and just have very little to eat. And of course, the other thing that happens when you have all those links in the chain is if one link below you that you depend on to get that carbon up to where you can eat it breaks, then everything above it's broken too. So you starve. So that's the idea behind understanding what happened, what the effect on the ecosystem was, because we know there was like a huge, after baleen evolved, there was actually like a huge explosion of diversity in the cetacea because of these resources that opened up, and then predators that eventually evolved to eat them, in terms of the large sharks and like the megalodon.
Does the ocean offer some extra stability for that? Because it seems like if you look at the modern day, the largest animals seem to be in the ocean now, right? I know the dinosaurs were quite large, but now it seems like the largest ones happen to occupy the oceans. Does that provide some kind of stability that land-based animals don't have?
It actually does. There is, well, there's a couple key things that the ocean does. One, um, you're in a neutrally buoyant liquid, so suddenly you don't have to worry about your knees and your spine supporting this huge weight. And there's a scaling issue that because the weight that your bones can support is a function of the square of the cross section of those bones, and your mass is a function of the cube of your volume, that you have this scaling rule that makes it really hard to get very large before you just like spontaneously have your femurs break. Um, And so there was that rule doesn't really apply in the ocean because you just aren't having any weight bearing parts because you're in a neutrally buoyant, essentially neutrally buoyant liquid. You're basically in zero G. So that's one thing that makes getting large more easily more 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 likely to evolve in the ocean. But the other thing that in terms of the dinosaurs is that it was just a much richer atmosphere. There's more oxygen in the atmosphere at the end of the Jurassic. I forget when. I think the Jurassic is the one that was at the end, right? That was before the the last the 64 million year ago impact. I can't remember what the sequence was, but there was a lot more oxygen in the atmosphere. There was a lot more plant matter. There was also a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So you had a lot of fast growing things and could get large. Dragonflies, for example, were the size of like golden eagles at the time because there's just more oxygen in the atmosphere. So things just got bigger there was more energy and more carbon available.
Now, for the purposes of your project, are there some uh, are larger animals easier, as an example, to study to find? I'm not familiar with the fossil records, so are the larger animals easier, smaller animals? What do we have more in the records?
Well, it's not so much a matter of large and small. It's about whether or not you had hard parts. So, like for example, there's lots like foraminifera are these little calcareous things that are actually phytoplankton, but they're abundant in the fossil record because they have little shells that get buried and accumulate and make limestone, basically. So lots of those, lots of mollusk and fossils that anything that makes carbon shell, anything that makes a silicate shell like a diatom, also plenty of that in the fossil records. Soft-bodied things like copepods and krill, lot less. Like we know a lot less, and there's also like virtually no fossil record of any gelatinous plankton, even or jellyfish. So things like ctenophores and jellyfish, small jellyfish, they're just completely absent. Even though sea turtles live on those, but we don't have any evidence that there's basically no evidence that they existed in the fossil record. They're incredibly rare. I'm not aware of any. I'm sure there's some out there somewhere. Anything with bones, which mammals have and most fish have, we can find those. But a lot of the intermediate sized things like the copepods, crabs, although crabs have enough hard parts that they don't have bones, but they have chitin and that can be preserved pretty well. So you have kind of like this intermediate zone on the plankton side where we don't have really good records. Although we're getting better about that because some of the stuff you can actually get fish DNA and DNA in the sediment just from eDNA from even not super deep time, but thousands of years past. So that's there.
Oh, that's interesting. I was not even aware that you can take DNA. I mean, you mentioned that it only goes back maybe a couple of thousand years, but that's fascinating that you can even do that. Um,
Yeah, and I don't remember the details right now, so don't quote me precisely, but it's a newer technology, but yeah, we're able to look at at eDNA in sediments to detect presence and absence of species that go back some hundreds or thousands of years. But I don't remember the exact details. It's still a pretty sort of like developing science, and the exact details I don't know offhand. I'm not, and I don't do it.
so does that help you then somehow like bridge some gaps in knowledge? So obviously some species still survive today, and some species are extinct. But is there a, a way of kind of helping you infer some of these interactions by noting what a particular species eats today, and that can kind of help you infer what they.
Absolutely. Yeah, we can look at we get a lot of information about what happened in past. So in the case of the Northwest Atlantic, the like the sort of historical reconstructions from the 1600s or whatever, all those species, virtually all those species still exist. We lost, we're missing things like giant auk and sea mink and a few others, but the species still exist somewhere for the most part. A lot of species have been extirpated. Walrus, for example, were actually quite abundant off of Nova Scotia until about 1800 or 1750 or so, which you wouldn't believe looking out the window today, but they're quite common. Um, and it's the same Atlantic walrus we still have. They're just now in Greenland and Labrador and in the much farther North Arctic. So we can look at those and go and know how what we should have expected for ecosystem connections and diets and stuff like that. Um, and that's so we have natural history data for all the ecosystem members for the most part for that, but we just don't have them all in the same ecosystem at the same time. And that's what we're trying to do. In the very deep past, for the whale work, the development of baleen, that's a little harder to know because there are going to be things like megalodon and species that we just know less about because they have never existed to be measured. In they've been extinct since well before humans evolved. So it's a little hard to know, but we know how white sharks work, and we can make some assumptions based on the ecology of other large sharks to understand what we should expect for the life history and diets of those species that are now extinct.
But now for you, are you doing more of the modeling side, or are you doing field work? You're doing a mixture of both?
Well, this was actually funded through the mathematics directorate. So this is very much a modeling based, because there's lots and lots of people. The thing is, we looked around and Justin in particular is basically a mathematician. I'm a statistician. Sora is more on the empirical side. She does isotope work on shark teeth, ancient shark teeth. Um, what is very clear is there's lots and lots of people digging up fossils and talking about these past ecosystems, but there's very few people. There's been very little attempt to sort of quantitatively reconstruct these ecosystems using the kinds of models that we have developed to understand the stability of modern ecosystems. Just because it's been too hard, or people didn't feel like it was something they could do, and so we're trying that. We're trying to sort of we're trying to figure out these methods. We don't actually know how well they're going to work, but we have reason to think they're going to work well. But we have to develop them first.
And so how stable are these across parameter values? I imagine obviously it's going to be different if under different ecosystems and things like that. But the models that you have, what kinds of ranges would provide for stable versus unstable uh, ecosystems?
Well, it's not so much parameter values because we don't know the parameters, but there are certain structures um, that are more stable than others, and certain kinds of links provide stability that and other kinds of links, or which is as to say like how one animal consumes another.
Oh, so this is the
Um,
network then you're talking about, right? Is that what?
exactly, yeah. Yeah, it's a network model, and that's all ecosystems are just big networks, and we as scientists, as in science, have been representing ecosystems that way for some time. And there's still some sort of paradoxes in the literature, such as the paradox of diversity, the paradox of enrichment, which is we 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 see traits that we sort of traditionally think, like the high diversity systems, like lots of species, we we traditionally associate that with higher stabilities, but when we model this stuff, we find that's actually less stable. But there's sort of islands of stability in there of certain structures and certain kinds of topologies of these networks that are more stable. And in some circumstances, when you have certain network topologies, which is just to say the structure, in how the network is structured, not just randomly, essentially, will be more stable than others. And other topologies will you pull out one ecosystem member, the whole thing reorganizes, and other members become extinct because of that.
And are these modeled as directed graphs? So it's like a connection. If one thing eats another thing, there's a directed connection between the two. Or is this just
Yeah,
an
yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly right. And then whether or not those connections exist is something that we determine probabilistically depending upon the size differential between those two species, and with the highest probability of a connection occurring when one species is 10% the size of the other. And then as you get further from that 10%, you have lower probability of connecting.
And when you say not random, I'm assuming you mean something like, say, an Erdos-Renyi model or something like that, that kind of random network structure. You said it's
When I
not,
say not random,
yeah, you said it's not
I
random.
mean when it's random in the statistical sense, in that the network connections are probabilistically determined, and in that sense, it's the whether or not there's a connection is a draw from a random variable, a random variate that's probabilistically determined. What I mean random is like you don't just have a big bag of species that you just randomly draw connections from. Between there's actually rules that cause them to be connected a certain way, and that those rules govern that will cause a certain structure to form that is not random.
That's very interesting. So part of obviously a major part of the podcast is we want people to know where their money's going. So what in your case, what kinds of things does the money fund? Is it 50% as labor or something, along those lines?
Well, most something like 60% of all of the science grants that get sent out is people. You need to provide scientists enough money to eat and shelter themselves in order for them to have the freedom to think about these problems and solve them. So in our case, we're bringing on a master's student, and that's um, something like $100,000 of the budget. And then there's overhead on top of that. So this is a pretty small budget, right? So the whole thing was like $300,000, and it's less than we were hoping for, but that's okay. We have enough to do a sort of proof of concept, which is all we've been trying to get, and we've been trying to get this funded for some time, but it's a high risk, high reward project, and NSF doesn't well, a lot of funding agencies don't like to do that, even though you can have huge steps forward. So we were given just a relatively small budget to just show that we can develop these things and can what what we can do with them. And so a big part of the budget is is just that graduate student, and then the overhead, which is whatever 50%, which keeps the lights on at my institution and helps pay for like the internet that I'm talking to you with here, things like that. And so we can, and then the other, there's a little bit of salary, like 3 weeks a year for me, because I'll be doing some work, and a little bit of travel, but very little travel. This is not extravagant. It's basically just for me to fly down to work directly with collaborators in California. So that's kind of the budget, and then and that that's all. It doesn't take very long, over 3 or 4 years, which is what we've budgeted here for that to be used up. And that it's a lot, but it's also not it's also not that much, and we get a lot from it in terms of understanding how the earth works and how ecosystems work in terms of, and then we can use that to conserve, and better understand, to manage and conserve our current oceans.
And the graduate student, is the student sort of shared between you and your collaborators, or the students sort of more on one side or the other?
They're going to be mostly based at UC Merced. Um, so that's the plan. They'll spend summers, or a summer or two in Alaska, but they'll be mostly based at UC Merced.
Nice. So at least they'll get to travel back and forth. That that'll be an
Yeah,
interest.
yeah.
Yeah. Um,
People like to come to Alaska, so.
so one thing that I personally am interested in, I like to hear these stories from people, is how did you get interested in science to begin with? You know, if you could map back to high school or earlier, maybe how did you get interested in science in general?
I was interested in butterflies as a kid, still interested, and I have another NSF project on butterfly ecology. Um, so that was sort of the beginning. That was like as a little kid, and then it just never stopped. I kept catching butterflies and bringing them home and keeping them in increasingly elaborate, setups to rear caterpillars through to, adulthood, and silk moths, and then at some point I was in the middle of the continent. I got interested in oceanography and marine science, and went to, after my undergraduate, which was in Minnesota. I'm from Wisconsin. Um, I went and did an oceanography degree at Texas A&M, and then to Canada to work on seals. Um, and that's where I started really thinking about marine mammals. And a lot of this current project came from experiences that, while working on seals on Sable Island, were, you know, that was right in the middle of this massive. So Sable Island is this island off of Nova Scotia. It's a little sandbar, about 25 miles long, I guess, 20, 25 miles long, but very narrow. It's shaped like a barrier island, but it's not near the coast. And it's got this huge population of seals on it, and whales would wash up all the time. And historically, it had this huge population of walrus, like tens of thousands of walrus. And you'd find skulls and tusks still. And so it was so evident that this ecosystem had been very different very recently. And that's the project. That experience is what really drove the motivation for this project. And it just sort of continues. There's just so much to learn about how the earth works and how animals work, how ecosystems work. It's just never really stopped. So, and it was, I did bump into some really encouraging college professors at the University of Wisconsin Green Bay, which is where I grew up when I was in high school. That really helped sort of keep me on a path that was into science, because there was a lot of cultural signals that I should do something else. Say, my dad wasn't really happy about it, but ultimately I made it. So um, he wanted me to be an engineer, like his dad. So, which is a kind of science, I guess, but it's not quite this. Well, I was really interested in biology. So,
So now, just because you mentioned growing up in Wisconsin, and you obviously went to Minnesota for a while, are you a hockey fan?
Not really, actually. I mean, grew up in Green Bay, and there's a football team there. You probably know
Yeah.
about it. There wasn't a huge lot. There wasn't. We don't have we don't have an NHL team in Wisconsin for reasons that make no sense. Um, we've got all the other major league teams, right? But no hockey team. So there wasn't really a, even though the college team is big, you know, there's a lot of hockey there, but I didn't actually grow up playing it, and I was one of those like tall, awkward, uncoordinated kids. So
But we benefited from you getting interested in science and going in that direction. So that's
yeah,
awesome.
exactly. Yeah, it worked out.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate having you on, and I was excited to have this episode. So I greatly appreciate you joining.
All right, excellent. I'm really happy.